There's a peculiar kind of prison we've built for ourselves, one without visible bars, without guards at the gates, without chains we can point to and say, this is what holds me captive. And yet, when you wake up each morning with that weight in your chest, when you move through your days performing a version of yourself that feels increasingly distant from who you truly are, when you lie awake at night wondering how your life became a series of obligations you never consciously chose, the walls are real. The most profound prisons aren't the ones that confine our bodies. They're the ones we construct inside ourselves, brick by invisible brick, until we've forgotten we ever knew how to be free. What if I told you that the greatest restriction of your liberty isn't happening to you, it's happening through you? That somewhere along the way, you learn to be your own jailer, your own taskmaster, your own judge and executioner of spontaneity, authenticity, and self-expression. This isn't a conspiracy. It's something far more intimate and far more devastating. It's the quiet surrender that happens when a child learns that being themselves isn't safe, that their natural impulses must be suppressed, that love is conditional upon performance. And that child grows up to become an adult who has perfected the art of self-imprisonment, all while believing they're simply being responsible, mature, realistic. We call it productivity. We call it success. We call it being a functioning member of society. But beneath these dignified labels lies a profound disconnection from our own aliveness, a systematic suppression of our authentic needs, and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of vacation days can touch. This is the new slavery not imposed by external force, but maintained by internal mechanisms so sophisticated that we defend them even as they drain the life from us. And the most heartbreaking part, we do it willingly. We do it proudly. We do it while judging those who resist as lazy, immature, or unrealistic. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. Most of us have no idea what freedom actually feels like. We spent so long adapting, performing, and suppressing that we've lost touch with the internal compass that once told us what we genuinely wanted, what brought us alive, what felt authentically right for us. From our earliest moments, we learned that certain parts of ourselves were acceptable and certain parts were not. We learned that love, attention, and safety were contingent upon behaving in specific ways. And so we developed what we might call a survival self, a carefully constructed version of who we needed to be in order to remain connected to those we depended upon. This wasn't a conscious choice. No child sits down and decides, I will now begin suppressing my authentic self in exchange for belonging. It happens organically, necessarily, as a response to the emotional environment we're born into. When a child's exuberance is met with irritation, when their sadness is dismissed as weakness, when their anger is punished as defiance, when their curiosity is redirected toward productivity, that child learns. They learn that who they are isn't quite right. They learn that survival requires becoming someone else. They learn that freedom is dangerous. And here's where the mechanism becomes truly insidious. Over time, this external control becomes internalized. The parent's critical voice becomes our inner critic. The societal demand for productivity becomes our own relentless drive. The cultural message that rest is laziness becomes our inability to stop moving. We no longer need external enforcers because we've become extraordinarily skilled at enforcing these restrictions upon ourselves. We've taken the chains that once bound us from the outside and forged them into our very identity. We call it discipline, we call it having a strong work ethic, we call it being responsible. But underneath, it's the same old fear that if we stop performing, if we stop proving, if we stop achieving, we will lose love, acceptance, belonging. Consider for a moment your daily life. How much of what you do emerges from genuine desire versus obligation? How many of your choices are truly yours versus performances of what you believe you should choose? When was the last time you asked yourself what you actually wanted, separate from what others expect, what society demands, what your internalized programming insists is necessary? For most of us, these questions are genuinely difficult to answer. Not because we're confused, but because we've spent so long disconnected from our authentic preferences that we've forgotten how to access them. This disconnection serves a purpose. When life requires us to continually override our genuine needs, when we must work jobs that deplete us, maintain relationships that drain us, perform roles that constrict us. The only way to survive is to stop feeling. We numb ourselves to our own dissatisfaction. We rationalize our exhaustion as temporary. We tell ourselves that everyone feels this way, that this is simply what adult life requires, that we're being dramatic or entitled to want something different. And in this numbness, in this disconnection, we become extraordinarily compliant. We become the perfect citizens of a system that requires our constant participation but never quite delivers the fulfillment it promises. The economic structure we live within depends upon this voluntary surrender. It requires workers who will trade the majority of their waking hours for money, even when that work brings no sense of meaning or contribution. It requires consumers who will attempt to fill internal voids with external purchases, seeking in objects what can only be found in authentic connection and self-expression. It requires people who are anxious enough to keep striving but never quite secure enough to stop. This isn't conspiracy, it's simply how systems optimize themselves, and we are the fuel that keeps the machine running. But here's what makes this particularly devastating from a trauma perspective. The system doesn't need to force us anymore. We've internalized the mechanisms so thoroughly that we force ourselves. We judge ourselves harshly when we rest. We feel guilty when we pursue activities that bring joy but don't produce economic value. We experience anxiety when we consider setting boundaries that might disappoint others. We've become our own oppressors. And we're often far more brutal than any external authority would dare to be. Think about the language we use around productivity and achievement. We talk about grinding, hustling, crushing it. We celebrate those who work 80-hour weeks, who sacrifice relationships for career advancement, who postpone living until some future moment when they've finally achieved enough. We've turned self-exploitation into a virtue. And when someone suggests that perhaps this isn't healthy, that perhaps we're sacrificing something essential on the altar of achievement, we dismiss them as naive or unrealistic. We defend our captivity as if it were freedom. This defense isn't accidental. It's psychologically necessary. When we've organized our entire lives around a particular set of values and suddenly confront the possibility that those values are actually harming us, the cognitive dissonance is unbearable. It's easier to double down, to insist that our exhaustion is noble, that our stress is the price of success, that our disconnection from ourselves is simply what maturity requires. The alternative, acknowledging that we've spent years, perhaps decades, moving in a direction that was never truly ours, is too painful to bear. And so we develop elaborate justifications. We tell ourselves that we're building security for our families, that we're creating a better future, that we're being realistic about what life requires. These justifications aren't entirely false. There are real constraints, real responsibilities, real consequences to our choices. But somewhere beneath these rational explanations lies a deeper truth. We're terrified of what might happen if we stop. We're terrified of disappointment, of judgment, of discovering that who we actually are isn't enough. We're terrified of freedom because freedom requires us to take responsibility for our own lives, to trust ourselves, to risk being authentically seen. This terror has deep roots. For a child who learned that being themselves led to rejection or punishment, authenticity becomes associated with danger. The nervous system learns that suppression equals safety, that performance equals love, that conformity equals belonging. These lessons don't simply disappear when we become adults. They live in our bodies as reflexive patterns of tension, anxiety, and self-monitoring. They shape how we move through the world, what opportunities we allow ourselves to consider, what dreams we permit ourselves to pursue. If this message resonates with you, consider subscribing so we can walk this healing path together. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward reclaiming our freedom. Let's look more deeply at how this internal slavery manifests in daily life. There's the constant sense of not doing enough, no matter how much you accomplish. There's the inability to rest without guilt, the feeling that downtime must be earned through sufficient productivity. There's the reflexive need to justify your choices to others, to explain why you're taking time off, why you're pursuing something that brings you joy, why you're not working yourself to exhaustion like everyone else. There's the persistent anxiety that whispers you're falling behind, that others are achieving more, that you should be further along by now. These aren't character flaws. They're symptoms of a nervous system that learned very early that worth is conditional, that love must be earned, that safety requires constant vigilance and achievement. When a child's experience teaches them that they must be extraordinary to be accepted, that ordinary is insufficient, that simply being isn't enough, that child grows up to become an adult who can never rest. They become someone who is always striving, always proving, always one step away from the imagined catastrophe of being revealed as inadequate. This driven quality might look like ambition from the outside. It might even produce impressive achievements. But underneath, it's not about genuine desire or authentic aspiration. It's about running from an internal sense of deficiency, about trying to fill a void that was created in childhood and can never be filled through external accomplishment. It's exhausting. It's ultimately futile. And it keeps us locked in a cycle of voluntary servitude, chasing goals that were never truly ours, measuring ourselves by standards we never consciously chose. Consider the relationship between this internal dynamic and the broader economic system. Capitalism, as it currently operates, requires endless growth, endless consumption, endless dissatisfaction. It needs people who always want more, who never feel that what they have is enough, who seek external solutions to internal emptiness. And what better workforce than people who are driven by unresolved childhood wounds, who believe their worth depends on achievement, who will work themselves to exhaustion in pursuit of a sense of adequacy that remains forever out of reach. This isn't to say that wanting to contribute meaningfully, to develop skills, to create value in the world is inherently problematic. Humans are naturally generative. We want to make things to help others, to feel that our presence matters. But there's a profound difference between contribution that emerges from authentic desire and contribution that's driven by a desperate need to prove we deserve to exist. One is enlivening, the other is depleting. One comes from fullness, the other comes from emptiness. One is freely chosen, the other is compulsively driven. How do you know which is operating in your life? Ask yourself, if no one ever knew about your achievements, if there were no social recognition, no financial reward, no proof of your worth, would you still do what you're doing? If the answer is an immediate yes, if you can feel the genuine pleasure and meaning in the activity itself, then you're likely operating from authentic desire. But if there's hesitation, if you realize that much of the motivation comes from external validation, from proving something, from not falling behind, then you're likely operating from that wounded place, from the survival self rather than the authentic self. This distinction matters because freedom isn't about having no responsibilities or never working hard. Freedom is about knowing that your choices are genuinely yours, that your actions emerge from authentic preference rather than unconscious compulsion. You can work intensely and still be free if that work is chosen rather than driven by internal necessity. You can have a simple life and still be imprisoned if every moment is constricted by fear, obligation, and suppression of genuine desire. The path toward freedom, then, isn't about changing your external circumstances, though sometimes that's part of it. The path begins with becoming aware of the internal mechanisms that maintain your captivity. It requires developing the capacity to notice when you're operating from fear versus desire, from obligation versus authentic choice, from the survival self versus the genuine self. This awareness is uncomfortable because once you start seeing these patterns, you can't unsee them. You begin to recognize how much of your life has been organized around avoiding rejection, pursuing approval, and proving your worth. And that recognition can feel devastating. But it's also the doorway to something different. Because once you see the cage, once you understand how it was constructed and what maintains it, you can begin to dismantle it. This dismantling isn't quick or easy. These patterns were established over years, reinforced thousands of times, integrated into your very sense of identity. They won't dissolve because you've intellectually understood them. They require patient, compassionate, embodied work. They require slowly learning to trust your own preferences, to honor your genuine needs, to tolerate the anxiety that arises when you stop performing. Let's talk about what this work actually looks like. It begins with the body, not the mind. Remember, these patterns were established before you had language, before you could think conceptually. They live in your nervous system as automatic responses. as patterns of tension and contraction that activate before conscious thought. So the work must be somatic. It must involve learning to sense what's happening in your body, to recognize the signals of authentic desire versus fear-driven compulsion. When you're about to say yes to something you don't actually want to do, there's usually a sensation in the body, a subtle constriction in the chest, a tightening in the throat, a sinking feeling in the gut. But we've learned to override these signals so consistently that we often don't even notice them anymore. Learning to pause, to check in with the body before responding, to ask, what do I actually feel, rather than immediately moving into what you think you should do. This is foundational work. It sounds simple, but for most of us, it's revolutionary. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may support someone else's journey toward recognizing these patterns. As you develop this capacity to sense your authentic response, you'll begin to notice how often you're performing rather than being. You'll catch yourself crafting your words for effect rather than speaking your truth. You'll notice the impulse to present a certain image rather than show up as you are. You'll recognize the subtle ways you contort yourself to fit others' expectations. And each time you notice, you have a choice to continue the pattern or to experiment with something different. These experiments don't have to be dramatic. You don't need to quit your job, end your relationships, or completely restructure your life overnight. In fact, dramatic changes made from reactive states often just recreate the same internal dynamics in a different context. Instead, the work is about small, consistent practices of honoring your truth. It's about saying, let me think about that, instead of immediately saying yes. It's about setting a boundary even when you feel guilty. It's about pursuing something that brings you joy even when it doesn't make sense to your rational mind. Each of these small acts of self-honoring sends a message to your nervous system. You matter. Your needs are important. You're allowed to take up space. These messages directly counter the childhood lessons that established your internal prison. And over time, with repetition and patience, your nervous system begins to update its understanding. The world doesn't end when you honor yourself. People don't abandon you when you set boundaries. You're still lovable even when you're not performing. But let's be honest about the challenges. When you start honoring your authentic self, when you stop compulsively accommodating and performing, you will encounter resistance. Some of it will come from others who benefited from your self-suppression, who are uncomfortable with your changes, who preferred you when you were more predictable and compliant. This external resistance can be painful, but it's actually the easier part. The harder resistance comes from inside. Your own mind will generate intense anxiety. It will tell you that you're being selfish, irresponsible, immature. It will predict catastrophic consequences. It will insist that you need to return to the old patterns immediately. This isn't your mind being cruel. It's trying to protect you based on old information. Remember, your nervous system learned that authenticity equals danger. So when you start being authentic, the nervous system sounds the alarm. It floods you with anxiety, trying to get you to return to the familiar strategy of suppression and performance. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the journey toward freedom. You must learn to tolerate anxiety without immediately acting to eliminate it. You must develop the capacity to feel the fear, acknowledge its protective intent, and still move toward what's authentic for you. This doesn't mean being reckless or ignoring genuine dangers. It means learning to distinguish between anxiety that's warning you of real threat versus anxiety that's simply activated because you're doing something unfamiliar, something that violates your old programming. How do you develop this discernment? By slowing down, by getting curious about your anxiety rather than immediately obeying it, by asking, what is this fear actually about? What's the worst case scenario my mind is generating? Is this based on present reality or past experience? Often, you'll discover that the fear is disproportionate to the actual situation. You're not really facing abandonment or annihilation. You're just considering saying no to an invitation, or expressing a preference, or taking time for rest. The anxiety feels life or death because that's how it felt in childhood. But you're not a child anymore. You have resources, capacities, and choices that weren't available then. This understanding that you're responding to past situations as if they're present threats is crucial for healing. When you can recognize that your intense anxiety about disappointing someone is actually about your childhood experience of conditional love, you create space. You can acknowledge the fear, understand where it came from, and still choose to act from your adult self rather than your wounded child self. This is the work of integration, bringing compassion to the younger parts of you that learn these survival strategies while slowly teaching your nervous system that different responses are now possible. Let's explore how this plays out in specific domains of life. In work, the voluntary slavery might look like staying in a job that depletes you because leaving feels too risky, because you've internalized the belief that security requires sacrificing your aliveness, because taking a different path would disappoint the parents whose approval you're still unconsciously seeking. The freedom work here isn't necessarily about immediately quitting. It's about getting honest with yourself, about why you stay, what you're actually afraid of, what authentic choice might look like, even within constraints. In relationships, the pattern might manifest as consistently prioritizing others' needs over your own, tolerating behavior that doesn't feel good to you, staying in connections that have become stagnant or draining. The underlying belief is that your worth depends on being needed, that asserting your needs will lead to abandonment, that love requires self-sacrifice. The healing path involves learning that genuine connection is only possible when both people are present as themselves, that relationships built on performance and accommodation are ultimately empty, that boundaries actually create the safety necessary for real intimacy. In your relationship with yourself, the slavery shows up as relentless self-criticism, as pushing yourself beyond healthy limits, as denying yourself rest, pleasure, or compassion. It's the voice that says you're not doing enough, that you should be better, that you don't deserve to feel good until you've achieved more. This internal taskmaster is often the harshest authority we face, and it operates constantly, monitoring your every action and finding you lacking. Learning to recognize this voice not as truth but as internalized conditioning is profound work. Subscribe to stay connected with future reflections and healing explorations that can support this journey of inner liberation. What would it mean to bring compassion to this whole pattern? Not judgment about how much of your life has been spent in voluntary captivity, but understanding about how it developed, why it made sense, how it was actually an intelligent adaptation to difficult circumstances. The child who learned to suppress themselves, to perform, to achieve that child, was doing the best they could with the resources available. They were ensuring survival in an environment that didn't support their authentic development. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength and resilience. The compassion extends to recognizing that these patterns persist not because you're broken or flawed, but because they're deeply wired into your nervous system. They became so automatic that they operate beneath conscious awareness. They feel like who you are rather than strategies you adopted. Dismantling them requires patience, gentleness, and consistent practice. It requires treating yourself the way you would treat a beloved friend who's learning something difficult, with encouragement, understanding, and acceptance of the inevitable setbacks. This compassionate approach is actually more effective than the harsh, demanding approach many of us default to. When we berate ourselves for our patterns, insist that we should just change, judge ourselves for how long it's taking, we're actually reinforcing the very dynamic we're trying to heal. We're being the harsh authority, demanding performance, making acceptance conditional on achievement. The alternative is to bring curiosity instead of judgment, patience instead of demand, kindness instead of criticism. This isn't indulgence, it's how actual change happens. Let's address a common concern. Won't this path toward freedom make you selfish, irresponsible, unable to function in the world? This fear itself reveals the depth of the conditioning. It assumes that without harsh internal control, without the driving force of fear and inadequacy, you would collapse into dysfunction. But this assumption is based on a profound misunderstanding of human nature. When people are genuinely connected to themselves, when they're not driven by wounds and compulsions, they're actually more generous, more engaged, more capable of authentic contribution. They give from overflow rather than depletion. They maintain boundaries that allow sustainable engagement rather than burning out. They bring their full presence rather than a performance of care while feeling empty inside. The truth is, the current system of voluntary slavery doesn't produce healthy functioning. It produces widespread exhaustion, anxiety, depression, and disconnection. It produces people who are going through the motions but feeling increasingly dead inside. It produces achievement without fulfillment, success without satisfaction, connection without intimacy. This isn't working, and on some level, you know this. That's why these words are resonating. That's why something in you is stirring, recognizing a truth you've been afraid to fully acknowledge. So what does genuine freedom actually look like? It's not the absence of all constraint or responsibility. It's not a hedonistic pursuit of pleasure without regard for consequences. It's something more subtle and more profound. It's the experience of making choices from a place of internal alignment rather than external pressure. It's the ability to say yes when you mean yes and no when you mean no. It's the capacity to feel your feelings without being overwhelmed by them or needing to immediately act on them. It's the sense of being at home in your own skin, of not constantly monitoring and adjusting yourself based on others' reactions. Freedom is waking up and checking in with yourself before checking your phone. It's noticing what you actually want for breakfast, rather than eating whatever's quick and efficient. It's allowing yourself to change your mind when new information arises, rather than rigidly adhering to previous commitments. It's speaking your truth even when your voice shakes. It's pursuing what calls to you even when it doesn't make sense to others. It's resting when you're tired, rather than pushing through. It's feeling your sadness, your anger, your joy, without needing to explain or justify these feelings. These might sound like small things, even trivial, but they're actually radical acts of self-reclamation. Each time you honor your authentic experience rather than overriding it, you're unwinding the mechanism of internal slavery. You're teaching your nervous system that it's safe to be yourself, that your preferences matter, that you don't need to constantly earn the right to exist. This learning happens slowly, through countless small moments of choosing differently. There's no dramatic transformation, no single insight that suddenly frees you. There's just a patient, consistent work of noticing your patterns and experimenting with new responses. Part of this work involves grieving the years spent disconnected from yourself, grieving the opportunities you didn't take because you were too afraid, grieving the relationships built on performance rather than authenticity, grieving the dreams you suppressed because they didn't fit the acceptable script. This grief is necessary and healthy. It honors what was lost while creating space for something new. But our culture doesn't make much room for grief, especially grief over abstract losses. We're told to be positive, to focus on the future, to not dwell on the past, and so we bypass the grief, which means we carry it unconsciously, where it manifests as depression, numbness, or chronic dissatisfaction. Allowing yourself to feel the grief is an act of freedom. It means you're no longer suppressing, no longer performing positivity when you feel sadness. It means you're trusting that your feelings are valid, that they deserve to be acknowledged, that working through them is more important than maintaining a facade. And interestingly, when you allow yourself to fully feel the grief, it moves through you. It doesn't stay stuck as depression. It doesn't harden into bitterness. It transforms into something else, often into energy, clarity, and renewed commitment to living differently. This brings us to the question of systemic change. If the voluntary slavery is maintained by both internal conditioning and external structures, can we truly be free while living within systems that exploit these patterns? This is a crucial question, and the answer is complex. Individual healing work is necessary but not sufficient. If we each do our personal work, but the broader structures remain unchanged, we'll continue to face pressure towards self-exploitation, continue to be surrounded by messaging that equates worth with productivity, continue to operate in economic systems that require our exhaustion. At the same time, systemic change requires individuals who have done enough healing work to imagine and create something different. If everyone is operating from unhealed wounds, from survival mode, from disconnection from their authentic selves, what kind of systems will they build? Likely ones that replicate the internal dynamics they know. So the personal and collective work are intertwined. As you heal your relationship with yourself, as you learn to honor your needs and set boundaries, as you stop volunteering for your own exploitation, you become less available to systems that depend on your compliance. You begin to seek out and create alternative ways of living and working. You become part of the collective immune response to toxic cultural patterns. This might look like advocating for workplace policies that honor human needs. It might look like participating in mutual aid networks that provide security outside traditional employment. It might look like creating art, writing, or media that challenges dominant narratives. It might look like raising children in ways that support their authentic development rather than training them for compliant productivity. There's no single path. The question is, given your specific circumstances, gifts, and resources, how can you contribute to creating conditions where freedom is more possible, not just for yourself, but for others? This isn't about perfection or purity. You can work within systems while also working to change them. You can use money while questioning the values of a growth at all costs economy. You can be productive while rejecting the equation of worth with output. The key is maintaining awareness, not allowing yourself to fully identify with any particular role or system. When you remember that you're a full human being with intrinsic worth beyond any function you perform, you're less likely to get completely absorbed into dehumanizing structures. Let's talk about the role of community in this liberation work. Healing from voluntary slavery is not a solitary journey. You need others who are engaged in similar work, who can reflect back your blind spots, who can encourage you when the path gets difficult, who can celebrate the small victories that the broader culture won't even recognize as significant. You need relationships where you can practice being authentic, where your attempts at honesty are met with curiosity rather than judgment, where you can fumble toward new ways of being without fear of rejection. This kind of community isn't easy to find, partly because so many relationships are built on the same patterns of performance and accommodation that characterize the voluntary slavery. But as you begin to change, as you start showing up more authentically, you naturally attract others who are on a similar path. You begin to recognize each other, and these connections, built on genuine presence rather than strategic performance, become laboratories for healing. They show you that it's possible to be seen and accepted as you actually are. They provide the corrective experience your nervous system needs, evidence that authenticity doesn't lead to abandonment, that vulnerability can be met with care, that you don't need to earn connection through achievement. What about the inevitable failures and setbacks? Because there will be many. You'll make commitments to yourself about living more authentically, and then you'll fall back into old patterns. You'll set a boundary and then immediately apologize and backtrack. You'll choose rest and then berate yourself for laziness. You'll speak your truth and then spend hours worrying about how it was received. These moments can feel like evidence that you can't change, that the patterns are too strong, that you're fundamentally stuck. But they're actually just part of the process. Change isn't linear. Neural pathways that have been reinforced for decades don't rewire overnight. The question isn't whether you'll have setbacks, you will. The question is how you respond to them. Can you bring compassion to the part of you that fell back into old patterns? Can you get curious about what triggered the regression? Can you recognize that just noticing the pattern is progress, even if you couldn't choose differently in the moment? Can you remind yourself that learning happens through repetition? That each time you become aware of a pattern, even if you don't change it, you're strengthening your capacity for future change. This compassionate, curious approach to setbacks is itself a practice of freedom. It's refusing to use your struggles as evidence of your inadequacy. It's choosing learning over judgment, patience over perfection. As you continue this work, you'll likely notice that your relationship with time shifts. When you're operating from the voluntary slavery, time is always scarce. There's never enough. You're always behind, always rushing, always feeling the pressure of everything that needs to be done. But this experience of time scarcity is largely constructed. Yes, there are real demands and constraints. But much of the frenetic quality comes from the internal driver, from the belief that you must constantly be doing to justify your existence, from the fear that if you slow down something terrible will happen. As you heal, as you learn to trust yourself and honor your rhythms, time begins to feel different. You discover that you actually have more spaciousness than you thought, that pause is possible, that you can move through your day with more presence and less urgency. This doesn't mean everything gets done, some things fall away, and you learn that this is okay. The world doesn't collapse when you stop trying to do everything. What you do accomplish tends to be of higher quality because you're more present with it. And the overall experience of life becomes more textured, more vivid, more yours. This shift in relationship with time is actually a shift in relationship with life itself. When you're in voluntary slavery, you're always living for some future moment when you've achieved enough, saved enough, proved enough. The present moment is just something to get through on the way to that imagined future. But that future never quite arrives. There's always another goal, another benchmark, another thing that needs to be accomplished before you can finally relax and be satisfied. This is the hamster wheel, and it keeps you running until you're exhausted or dead. Freedom is discovering that the only moment that actually exists is this one, not in some shallow self-help platitude way, but as a genuine recognition that your life is happening now, not in some theoretical future, now. And if you're spending all your present moments in service of a future that never arrives, you're literally sacrificing your life. This recognition can be sobering, even painful, but it's also liberating. Because if life is now, then the question becomes, how do you want to be in this moment? Not how can you maximize productivity or achievement, but how do you want to actually be? This might mean bringing more consciousness to mundane activities, really tasting your food rather than eating while working, actually listening when someone is speaking rather than planning your response, feeling the water on your skin in the shower rather than using the time to mentally rehearse your day. These practices of presence might seem disconnected from the larger question of freedom, but they're actually central, because the voluntary slavery is maintained by dissociation. By being anywhere but where you are, presence is revolutionary. It means you're here, feeling, sensing, alive, rather than being a ghost going through programmed motions. Let me offer you a meditation as we move toward the conclusion of this exploration. Take a moment, if you're able, to simply notice your breath. Not to change it, just to notice it. Feel where you sense the breath most clearly. Maybe the coolness at your nostrils. Maybe the expansion of your ribs. Maybe the rise and fall of your belly. And as you stay with the breath, see if you can notice. Is there tension anywhere in your body? Are you holding, clenching, bracing? Just notice, without judgment. Now ask yourself, what am I afraid might happen if I truly relax this tension? What am I guarding against? What am I protecting? You might not get a clear answer, and that's fine. Just asking the question begins to bring awareness to the unconscious mechanisms of self-contraction. And in that awareness, there's possibility. Not a possibility you need to force or figure out, but simply an opening, a recognition that perhaps right now, in this moment, you could release just a tiny bit of the holding, not forever, not completely, just for this breath, just this one. This is where freedom lives, not in some grand transformation, but in these small moments of choice. Moments where you notice you're clenching and you soften slightly. Moments where you catch yourself about to say yes when you mean no, and you pause. Moments where you recognize you're performing, and you let yourself be a little more real. These moments accumulate. They train your nervous system in a new possibility. They prove to the frightened parts of you that authenticity doesn't equal annihilation. As we come toward the end of this reflection, I want to acknowledge something important. This work is hard. Becoming free from voluntary slavery is one of the most challenging journeys you can undertake, because it requires confronting everything you've been avoiding, feeling everything you've been numbing, acknowledging all the ways you've been betraying yourself. It would be easier to just keep going as you have been, to stay asleep, to maintain the comfortable numbness. And sometimes, especially when you're tired or overwhelmed, that's what you'll do. And that's okay. This isn't about perfection. It's about slowly, gradually, patiently reclaiming your life. But I also want to name that this work is profoundly meaningful. Every step you take toward greater authenticity, every moment you choose presence over dissociation, every boundary you set, even though you're afraid these matter, they matter for you, certainly. They matter for the people in your life who will benefit from your greater wholeness. And they matter for the collective, because each person who refuses to participate in their own exploitation creates a small crack in the larger system. These cracks accumulate. They create space for new possibilities. They model to others that different ways of living are available. You're not alone in this work, even though it might feel lonely sometimes. All around the world, people are waking up to the recognition that the way we've been living isn't sustainable, isn't healthy, isn't aligned with our deepest values. They're beginning to question the narratives about productivity and success and worth. They're searching for more authentic, connected, meaningful ways of being. You're part of this movement this quiet revolution of people reclaiming their humanity from systems that would reduce them to functions. So here's my invitation as we close. Notice where you are right now, not where you think you should be, not where you wish you were, but where you actually are in this journey. Can you bring some compassion to yourself exactly as you are? Can you acknowledge both how far you've come and how far you still feel you need to go? Can you recognize your own courage in even considering these questions, in being willing to look honestly at your patterns, in opening to the possibility of living differently? And then, from that place of self-compassion, ask yourself, what's one small way I could honor myself more fully? Not a dramatic change, just one small thing. Maybe it's taking 5 minutes in the morning to check in with yourself before looking at your phone. Maybe it's speaking up about a preference you usually suppress. Maybe it's saying no to something that depletes you. Maybe it's allowing yourself to rest without guilt. Just one small thing, and notice how it feels to consider this. Notice the part that wants to move toward it and the part that's afraid. Both are welcome. Both make sense. Remember, you are not your productivity. You are not your achievements. You are not the roles you perform or the functions you fulfill. You are a human being with intrinsic worth, with legitimate needs, with a right to exist exactly as you are. This isn't something you need to earn or prove. It's your birthright. And every moment you live from that recognition, every choice you make from that place of inherent worthiness, is a step toward freedom. The path from voluntary slavery to authentic freedom isn't a straight line. It's winding, uncertain, full of moments of doubt and regression. But it's also full of moments of genuine aliveness, of feeling truly yourself, of experiencing the profound relief that comes from no longer pretending. These moments are worth the difficulty. They're worth the discomfort of change. They're worth the risk of disappointing others or disrupting systems that benefited from your compliance. You deserve to feel at home in your own life. You deserve to wake up with a sense of possibility rather than dread. You deserve relationships where you can be authentic. You deserve work that's meaningful rather than merely obligatory. You deserve to move through your days with presence rather than dissociation. This isn't entitlement, it's what's possible when we stop accepting the diminished existence that voluntary slavery offers. So I'll leave you with this. The cage you're in has no lock. The chains you wear were put there by your own hands, which means your own hands can remove them. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, courageously, compassionately. You have everything you need to begin. The question is simply whether you're willing, whether the pain of staying the same has finally become greater than the fear of change, whether you're ready to discover who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the performance, all the suppression. I hope you are. The world needs people who are genuinely free, who can imagine and create alternatives to systems built on exploitation. But more importantly, you need this for yourself. You deserve to experience your one precious life as fully as possible. You deserve to be free. If this journey resonates with you, subscribe so we can continue walking this path together. Share your reflections, your struggles, your small victories. We're in this together, learning to reclaim our freedom one conscious choice at a time. Thank you for being here, for listening, for having the courage to question. Your willingness to look honestly at these patterns is already an act of liberation. Keep going. You're doing important work.